This is the story of the Christmas visitor, a tale of ancient warnings, forgotten traditions, and a knock at the door that you should never, ever answer. If you think you're brave enough, stay with us, but I'll warn you, once you hear the knock, you'll never forget it.
Emma stared out the frosted window of her childhood home, her breath fogging the glass. The snow fell in gentle drifts, blanketing the yard and the woods beyond in pristine white. It was the kind of scene her mother would have loved. Peaceful, festive, full of Christmas charm.
But the house felt empty without her mother's laughter echoing in the halls. This was Emma's first Christmas alone, and it was nothing like she had imagined. Her siblings had their own lives, their own traditions. Her father, too grief-stricken since her mother's passing, had opted to spend the holidays abroad with friends. Emma stayed behind, clinging to the house and the memories it held. She thought the decorations might help. Garlands draped over the fireplace, stockings hung in a neat row, the tree glowing with twinkling lights. Yet the warmth she sought remained elusive. She set down her mug of tea and sighed, glancing at the cluttered boxes of Christmas ornaments still sitting by the tree. Among them was an unfamiliar, weathered box she didn't remember seeing before. She picked it up, noting how heavy it felt for its size. Inside were antique ornaments, their delicate surfaces reflecting the firelight. One in particular caught her eye, a cracked red bulb with gold lettering etched into its surface. She squinted at the faint inscription, "The night he knocks, you must not answer." Emma chuckled nervously, brushing off the cryptic phrase as a relic of her mother's quirky sense of humor. She hung the ornaments on the tree, marveling at how beautiful they looked despite their age. As the last bulb found its place, she felt an odd twinge in the air, a static charge, almost imperceptible but enough to make the hairs on her arms stand on end. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Emma lay in bed, tossing and turning. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a faint memory from years ago. Always keep the traditions, Emma. They matter more than you know. She drifted into a fitful sleep, only to wake with a start hours later. The room was silent now, eerily so. She glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. A chill ran through her as she registered the faint sound of knocking. Knock, knock. It wasn't at the front door. The sound came from the window at the end of the hallway. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she crept out of bed, her bare feet whispering against the cold wooden floor. As she reached the window, she pulled back the curtain with trembling hands. There was no one there. But in the snow below, a single set of footprints led from the woods to her window, and back again. The next morning, Emma stood on the porch, staring at the footprints. They were deep and oddly spaced, as though whoever or whatever had made them had an unnatural gait. She followed them to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared entirely, leaving no trace of a return path. She spent the day trying to distract herself. Calls to her siblings went unanswered, and every attempt to focus on holiday tasks only brought her back to the same question. Who, or what, had been outside her house last night? As dusk settled over the town, Emma noticed the lights on the tree flickering. She checked the wiring, finding nothing wrong. Then, as she adjusted the last strand, she noticed an ornament spinning slowly on its own. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached out to stop it, but the moment her fingers touched the glass, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness. Emma's phone buzzed on the coffee table, a security camera alert. Her hands shook as she opened the app. The grainy feed showed the front porch, the snow beyond illuminated by the glow of the porch light. A tall figure stood just outside the camera's view. All that was visible was the edge of a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Before she could process what she was seeing, the feed cut to static. Desperate for answers, Emma returned to the box of ornaments. Beneath the red bulb was a folded piece of yellowed paper. The handwriting was her mother's, though shakier than she remembered. "Emma, if you're reading this, you must finish what I started. The ornaments are your shield. Keep the traditions. Light the candle. Do not answer the door after dark." Her mother had always been superstitious, but this was different. It wasn't the usual folklore or tales meant to scare children. It felt urgent, real. Emma placed the red bulb back on the tree, whispered a silent prayer, and lit a candle by the fireplace. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the knocking began again. Knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Emma's heart raced as she crept toward the door, her mother's warning echoing in her mind. She peered through the peephole. The figure stood there, motionless, his face obscured by shadows. His head tilted slightly, as if listening. Emma backed away, clutching the candle. The room grew colder with each passing second. Frost crept up the windows, and the shadows on the walls began to shift, twisting into unnatural shapes. The knocking stopped. Silence enveloped the house. And then the voice came, low and guttural, reverberating through the walls. "Let me in, Emma." The voice sent shivers down Emma's spine. She gripped the candle tighter, its small flame flickering as though the visitor's words had reached even the air around her. The room was still, yet she felt an undeniable presence, heavy and suffocating. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting to the fireplace. Her mother's note had mentioned keeping the traditions, and the candle was part of it. But what else? The tree lights, the milk and cookies. Was there something she had forgotten? The knocking resumed, harder this time. The entire door frame rattled. Emma ran to her phone and dialed 911, her hands trembling. The call connected, but instead of a voice on the other end, she heard static, interspersed with faint whispers. "Let me in, Emma." The voice came again, clearer now, as though the visitor was inside the house. She dropped the phone and ran to the box of ornaments, frantically searching for more clues. Beneath a layer of tissue paper, she found another note. This one scrawled hastily. "Do not cross the threshold. The line will hold." Emma's gaze snapped to the front door. The threshold. Her mother must have meant the space between the door and the house itself. She grabbed a bag of salt from the kitchen and poured a thick line across the doorway, then around every window and entrance she could think of. The knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. The next morning, Emma ventured outside to inspect the property. The snow was undisturbed except for a new set of footprints, identical to the ones from the night before, but this time they circled the house. Her unease deepened. It wasn't just the house being targeted. It was her. Determined to understand what she was dealing with, Emma drove into town to visit the local library. The town historian, Mrs. Calloway, had known her family for years. If anyone could explain the strange ornaments or the cryptic warnings, it would be her. Mrs. Calloway listened intently as Emma recounted the events of the past few nights. When Emma described the figure in the hat, the older woman's face paled. "You've seen him?" Mrs. Calloway whispered. "The Christmas visitor." Emma frowned. "You've heard of him?" Mrs. Calloway nodded, lowering her voice. "The legend dates back centuries. A man who wandered the woods during a brutal winter, searching for shelter. They say he was turned away from every door, and when he froze to death, his spirit cursed those who failed to show kindness. He knocks every Christmas, seeking an invitation. But those who let him in." Her voice trailed off, but the fear in her eyes said enough. Mrs. Calloway pulled an old book from the shelf, its cover worn and brittle. She flipped through the pages until she found a faded illustration of a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat, standing at the edge of a snowy forest. "The visitor preys on the lonely and the grieving," Mrs. Calloway explained. "He feeds on fear and despair. Your mother must have known. Those ornaments weren't just decorations, they were protection." Emma's hands tightened on the book. Why didn't she tell me? Mrs. Calloway gave her a sad smile. Perhaps she thought you wouldn't believe her, or maybe she hoped you'd never need to know. The librarian handed Emma a final piece of advice. Do not let him inside. Whatever happens, you must resist. That evening, Emma returned home armed with new resolve. She placed every ornament from the box back on the tree, making sure each one was secure. She poured more salt around the house and lit candles in every room. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of dread began to creep over her. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. At 11:47 p.m., the knocking began again. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It echoed from every window, every wall, a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Emma clutched her mother's note, reading the words aloud like a mantra. Do not let him in. The line will hold. The voice returned, more insistent now. Let me in, Emma. You're all alone. I can help you. The shadows on the walls began to shift, coalescing into the shape of the visitor. His void-like face stared at her, and for the first time, Emma felt the weight of his presence pressing down on her chest. In a moment of panic, Emma made a mistake. She reached for the door, intending to secure the locks, but her foot crossed the line of salt. The barrier broke, and the house seemed to shudder in response. The visitor stepped through the shadows, his form solidifying as he entered the room. His presence was overwhelming, filling the air with an icy chill. Emma screamed, stumbling back as he reached for her. But before he could touch her, the ornaments on the tree began to glow. The light grew brighter, forcing the visitor to recoil. Emma seized the moment. She grabbed the red bulb and hurled it at the visitor. The glass shattered, releasing a blinding burst of light. The visitor let out an unearthly wail, his form disintegrating into wisps of shadow. The house fell silent once more. In the weeks that followed, Emma repaired the house and tried to move on. But every time she passed the tree, she felt a lingering sense of unease. She made a vow to herself. Every Christmas, she would keep the traditions alive. The candles, the ornaments, the salt. All of it would remain, a shield against whatever darkness lingered in the woods. As the first snow of the new season fell, Emma placed a plate of cookies by the fireplace and whispered a silent prayer. Outside, in the distance, a tall figure watched from the shadows, waiting.